choices shape the market, our society, and our quality of life. That's why Euroconsumers helps millions of people in their daily choices, providing simple solutions to complex problems. Euroconsumers is a cluster of organizations, a network of people, a group established to protect consumer rights and well-being that brings consumers and companies together in transparent relationships of trust that respect their independence. Our deep understanding of products and consumption gives consumers a credible expert voice worldwide. We bridge the gap between buyers and manufacturers, between supply and demand. And in this digital age, we create opportunities for all parties to come together in constructive dialogue, partnering to build a future of better products and services. Euroconsumers has the power of a global group that believes humanity can develop, grow, and change for the better, and that we can promote this by uniting millions of consumers in strength and speaking responsibly for them, while simultaneously engaging in relationships of trust with responsible, sustainable companies.
Hello and welcome everyone to Euroconsumers Start Talking webinar. Welcome to everyone watching live and those who are watching the recording or listening. I'm Liz Cole, I'll be your host for today. And today the topic is Pay or OK, the future rules of the consumer data game. I'm going to spend a few minutes just briefly outlining why we're talking about this topic now and how we got here. So let's quickly recap. We know our personal data is a vital part of the digital ecosystem. Information about our patterns, behaviors, purchasing, relationships, identity, all of that's collected, analyzed and monetized via advertising. And this makes a lot of the services which very large tech companies provide essentially free to use, in that we make no financial payment to use them. And behind that, in the EU, there's a legal framework around the way that data can be processed. And that's on the basis of three things. So if you just hold these in mind, we've got the basis of a contract, legitimate interest, or consent. Now, let's go back to December last year. The EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, said that contract is not an appropriate legal basis for processing personal data for behavioural advertising. Then in April 2023, Meta informed the Irish Data Protection Authority that it was going to then change the legal basis it used for behavioural advertising from contract to legitimate interest. Different data protection agencies began to assess compliance, scratch their head about what this change might mean. The Norwegian Data Protection Authority, who we have with us today, then stepped in a month later in May and requested that the Irish DPA temporarily bans the processing of personal data for personal data for behavioural advertising based on legitimate interest. The Irish DPA said they'd wait on a closely related European Court of Justice decision regarding a case involving Meta and the German Competition Agency. This case began a few years ago in 2019, when the German Competition Agency accused Meta of abusing its dominant market position in the way it processed off Facebook data, so data on apps or ticking likes, etc., and that this wasn't justified under the GDPR. Meta challenged this and brought the case to the Court of Justice in July 2023. Now, we're nearly there, just bear with us. So there was a decision in July 2023 from the European Court of Justice that's really relevant and has brought about this discussion today. On the procedural side, there's something interesting in that the court ruled that competition authorities in the EU could were able to investigate infringements of GDPR if the company was thought to be dominating their position. So that's a procedural thing. Into the substance, the European courts ruled contractual basis was not okay for using personal data for behavioural advertising, closing that off as an avenue or strictly limiting it. It also ruled that legitimate interest basis was not okay, because to rely on a legitimate interest basis, it has to be within reasonable expectations to deliver on the legitimate interests of the data controller, bearing in mind that the fundamental rights of a data subject, so us as users, can override those of the data controller. So that avenue was closed off. So then we have only consent use available as a lawful basis for processing consumer data for behavioural advertising. The court then said for this consent to be valid and freely given, a consumer must be able to refuse this type of processing. It then mentioned that consumers could, if necessary, for an appropriate fee, be offered an equivalent service without an alternative to that, without data processing for behavioural advertising. And it's this wording that sparked Meta's proposal to offer consumers the choice between paying between 10 to 13 euros a month to access Facebook and Instagram, or to continue with paying nothing and accepting behavioural advertising. This has become known as pay or okay. And this is where we start talking today, as the implications of this offer and the future ramifications of what it might mean begin to emerge. So we've got 4 people with us today who are going to help pick apart all the different aspects of this move from Meta, looking at it from all different angles. And we have with us today Liz Brandt, who's co-founder and CEO of Control Shift. And she spent what she describes as her long career focusing on the opportunities that make the sustainable use of personal data, that brings the opportunities for businesses, individuals, and society. Next, we have Toby Udine, who heads the international section at the Norwegian Data Protection Authority. He represents Norway in the European Data Protection Board, and he's co-chair of the Global Privacy Assembly's International Enforcement Working Group. Next, we have Augustin Reyna, who's head of legal and economic affairs at BEUC, which is the European Consumer Organization. There, he supervises policy on financial markets, digital, consumer rights and enforcement, and leads and coordinates all the organization's work on competition law. And our final guest to make up this fabulous panel today is Nathalie Lanoret, who is Vice President, Government Affairs and Public Policy at Criteo. Criteo is the first independent global ad tech provider. She's more than 20 years' experience in digital policy and legal matters, and was previously director of the Centre for Information and Policy Leadership in Brussels, which is a global privacy and data policy think tank. Welcome, everybody, to Start Talking. Right, I'm going to let you talk now. The first question to Toby. We're very familiar with cases where consumers already have a choice of whether to have an ad-supported service or pay for it. So things like Netflix or Spotify, which offer both, and then many newspapers in Austria and Germany offering exactly this cookie wall. So, you take the advertising or you make the payment. So what's different about what Meta has proposed here?
I think that's a really good question, because obviously it's up to the services themselves how much money they want to charge, and whether they want to have an ads-based business model. That's fine, that's established. We don't necessarily have an issue with that. What is a bit different here is that if you want so let's say if you don't want to pay, if you're fine with seeing ads on Meta will also interpret that as a consent in terms of data protection law, and you would then be considered by Meta to have consented to behavioral advertising, profiling, really, I would argue, quite intrusive collection and processing of your personal data. And that is a bit different from the business models that we have seen. I think if Spotify charges users, that does make sense, because obviously music is produced by someone, they need to get paid. In terms of what Meta is doing, Meta is not necessarily paying the people who produce content for producing content. They're just providing the platform. But the question here is, if you're given sort of a choice whether you want ads or not ads, why is this also being perceived as a consent under data protection law to particular data processing? Because arguably you could say, well, yeah, go ahead. you could do ads, but I would still like ads that are not based on intrusive data processing. I'd like contextual ads, generalized ads, etc.
Okay. So, and you're not particularly pleased with Meta's move. Can you explain what it is from the data protection point of view that you're unhappy with?
So essentially, the Court of Justice of the European Union has stated that you can use this kind of pay or okay model, but under certain conditions. So first of all, the Court of Justice has said that you can use that in a situation of sort of conditionality where the platform wants to kind of have your acceptance for certain processing matters, but only to the extent that imposing such a fee would be necessary. So the platform would then need to show somehow that actually, in this case, it would not be possible to offer this service on the market if you don't have this kind of fee. And then again, that would have to kind of show that it's not possible actually to generate revenue from other forms of advertising that are not as intrusive. Again, contextual advertising, other forms of personalized advertising. Additionally, the Court of Justice said that, well, this is one aspect, the conditionality part, but you also need to actually demonstrate that users have a free choice and that there are any improper power imbalances. And so for us, this means you actually have to look at, okay, what choices are available to a consumer within this particular market or within this particular setting. And we know that people are heavily reliant on specifically Facebook and Instagram. For many people, that's where they get information that they rely on. That's where they interact with people online. It's a big part of their online digital lives. And seeing as there aren't too many alternatives, perhaps not many at all, not any alternatives, you can't just switch to Pinterest and expect to, exchange holiday pics with your friends there. It does put consumers in a very difficult position. And that from a legal point of view in data protection, the question then is, well, is the choice really voluntary and freely given?
Okay, so that's bringing in the competition element into data protection, which was also something that was interesting about the court judgment. We're seeing them overlapping a bit. Natalie, I'm going to come to you now because your business is a key part of this ecosystem. And, you obviously work with Meta, but we're keen to stress you're not in any way the voice of Meta here today, but you are able to bring your perspective on how this ad-based monetization works and what pay okay might mean. So first of all, can you tell us about what Criteo does, and then tell us what your take on this latest move by Meta is?
Sure, thank you, Liz. So Criteo is actually a French headquartered ad tech technology provider, and most of the services that we provide are powered by AI. And of course, we provide not only, but also targeted ad services. And our customers are the advertisers that want to promote their products online. But at the same time, we also enable free access to information from our partners who are the publishers. And we operate in the open internet, which means outside of walled gardens. We are a B2B company, which means that we do not have a direct interface with users. And lastly, we only process pseudonymized data because we received it already pseudonymized from our partners, and we are not able to re-identify the data that we receive. So in terms of, what is our position on Meta's latest move, well, we think it's actually an additional offer that is made to consumers based on a company right to define its own business model in a free market economy where prices can be set freely, and providing several alternatives to consumer, either to have free access with personalized ads, or paying to get access with no ads. But what I want to stress here first is that unlike data protection, which is, of course, and this is undisputed, a fundamental right, there is no such fundamental right to access a platform, a service, a specific service. And as far as France is concerned, actually, what Meta proposes is something that is already common on the digital market, because we've had some case law, including our French Data Protection Authority decision to actually ban cookie walls, which are those pop-ups that ask you whether you want to accept ads or you cannot access content. And this was actually struck down by the Supreme Court of France, the Conseil d'État. And so this triggered some new offers on the market where some publishers are now proposing several options. And I don't think there's any limit to the options that can be proposed. So you have, of course, the option to accept ads, but you also have options where you can decide how much you want to pay. And the more you pay, the more you can access to content. So all in all, stressing again, I think this is an offer in a free market economy that we know, just like in the real world, where you can get a bag for 10 euros somewhere and have another offer somewhere else where it would be 5,000 euros or even more. But this is how it works in our free economy.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Augustine, I'd like to see how you want to respond to that. This is just, Natalie says this is just more choice. We're in a free economy. Consumers have the choice. What's the problem? You're on mute, Augustine.
Yes, I think get used to it. Thank you, Liz, for the invitation. Well, to start with, I will not say that everything is for free. On the contrary, nothing is for free in this world. Either you provide data or you are exposed to advertising, but no company will do anything for free. Somewhere and somehow, services are monetized. And this is something that we need to keep in mind, because currently under EU consumer law, it is illegal to say that something is for free when reality is not. And Meta is not providing a service for free to consumers. Toby already mentioned the data protection concerns, and we have also consumer protection concerns. And Beu, for example, has filed a complaint against Meta before what we call the Consumer Protection Cooperation Network, which is the network of national consumer authorities, together with 19 of our members. And in essence, we believe that Meta, with these new changes, is breaching the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which applies alongside other instruments, such as the General Data Protection Regulation or the Digital Markets Act. And for us, this is a first step, because Meta behavior is also likely to breach the GDPR. And we have seen that there are already complaints that have been launched. There is one already by Noib. But in our complaint, from the point of view of consumer protection, we have identified 4 grounds, and we are asking the consumer authorities to investigate. And this concerns exactly that point, how choices are being presented to consumers. In the first instance, we consider that Meta is partially blocking the use of Facebook and Instagram until users have selected one of the options. And this, from our perspective, will constitute an aggressive practice under European consumer law. And this is because it creates the sense of urgency, which makes people to pick a choice, to make a choice that they might not want to take or make. In a second instance, many consumers likely think that by opting for the paid subscription, as it is presented, they will get a privacy-friendly option involving less tracking and profiling. But in fact, users are likely to continue to have their personal data collected and used, but could be for other purposes than advertising. In a third instance, Meta provides misleading and incomplete information to consumers, which does not allow them to make an informed choice, which is something that is essential in a market economy. Consumers need to be able to vote with their feet. And Meta is misleading consumers by presenting the choice between a paying and a free option, while, as I said before, this option is not for free because consumers pay Meta through the provision of their data, and past court rulings have already declared that. And finally, and I think that concerns also the competition point, given the market power of Meta's Facebook and Instagram services in the EU and the very strong network effects of social media platforms, it was mentioned earlier, the situation of walled gardens, consumers do not have a real choice, because if they quit the services, they will lose all their contacts and interactions built over the years. So certainly this needs to be put into the broader context of what are the competition dynamics in digital markets.
Okay, thank you. So there's even more to this than just the data protection and competition. We've also got consumer protection angle. I suppose one thing that struck me is, has the EU system, and granted the EU has led on digital regulation and is sort of learning for everybody as it goes, because it's doing lots of these things first. Is this rather complicated system of data protection, competition regulation, consumer protection, creating these problems for itself? Because behavioral advertising, if done in the right way, is not actually illegal, is it? So if the other legal bases have been said to be inappropriate by the court, then isn't it isn't it obvious that we've ended up here if the court has left the option for a fee?
Well, that would imply that actually the problem is in the law, which personally I believe that the problem is with the companies themselves. And for example, just think about that same statement, but applied to the chemicals legislation. Who would think of blaming REACH, which is the legislation that applies to chemicals, for preventing companies to bring into European markets cheaper products with asbestos? So there is a reason why this legislation is being adopted, being to protect people's fundamental rights, consumer protection, create more contestable markets. But of course, the effectiveness of those laws depend on companies making meaningful changes in the way they operate, and not just some cosmetic adaptations that we have seen in the past, or even worse, changes that will render the company even non-compliant, like it will be the case we're discussing now. And Meta could be compliant with European laws, but that, of course, requires them to change their business models. And we know that companies resist or not very keen to do that in the first place. And it is true that behavioral advertising has not been declared illegal per se. What is illegal is to do behavioral advertising breaching the law. And you mentioned the case of the jurisprudence of the court. Well, the court says that payment, for example, is only one alternative. And there are other options that could include contextual advertising, or Toby already mentioned, to other systems. So I think that we also need to consider what are the different alternatives that could be applied in these cases.
Okay, that's interesting. So you think it's not so much a problem with the law, but a problem with the companies who are going to resist these changes, which is not surprising. That's what they built their business models on. There's a question coming in from the audience, which is, the service has to be the same under both options. So is this change just about the means of paying for the service? And is that okay? I mean, we're just asking people to pay for it in a different way. Tobias, do you want to take that one or not?
I could give it a go. Surely this is about paying for the service, but also it's actually about profit maximization. And I think that difference is quite essential here, because there are many ways in which you can charge for your service. What we're seeing in this particular case is that it's actually differential pricing, because if you want data protection, then you're kind of penalized for that. And you referenced, Liz, that there are complaints made under, and also Augustine mentioned that there are complaints made also under the GDPR from the data protection angle. One of those complaints actually argues that the fee being imposed on users is higher than what actually the company makes. So I think it's not just about how you pay for it. It's actually a number of issues here. But you could also pay for the service just by seeing ads that are not very behavioral or not very much personalized. So that would probably also be a way of paying for it. But when you need to pay by money as well, and you're kind of given this dichotomy between all or nothing, then it's actually bigger than that, I would argue.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the question of pricing later, but I want to step back a bit from the legalities and look at the bigger picture of this consumer data system which we all live in. And I'm going to move to Liz Brandt to take this one up. You've spent many years working to develop a safe, trusted data system and an infrastructure that works for consumers and industry. So reflecting on what you've heard from the other panelists and from the questions from the audience, do you think we're looking at this the right way, or are we missing something in the bigger picture?
Hi Liz, great to see you, and thanks for today. It's brilliant, and it's great to hear everybody. I think so many important points in what is so important about our privacy. I think, however, we're moving into a slightly different phase where privacy is important, but data and how it works for growth is as important. And it's that we've been looking to develop over these years, where we have both privacy and growth. But looking at where we are, and we step back, as you say, two sayings come to mind. One is, and that's another fine mess you've got me into. And the other one is, be careful for what you wish. Because I think the fine mess we've got ourselves into is the big tech companies have developed in a market which is, ungoverned at the time, and have developed huge amounts of network effects to actually develop value for individuals. And in that, obviously, have huge numbers of consumers. And now when we look at that and we try to unpick the privacy issue from the value issue, we are, it seems to me, trying to pick a fight with both at the same time. So what we need to do is look at what's the privacy issue and what's the value issue. And when we pick at the privacy issue, I see the move by Meta being one of a service and value issue. So they're putting a new service value forward, not a privacy value forward, if you see what I mean. So we're trying what we're actually trying to do, when you sort of step back with all of the new legislation that's coming through. GDPR was just the beginning. In Europe, we've got the DGA, the DMA, we've got EIDAS coming through, similar legislation coming through in the UK. So what we're trying to do is unpick that data from those services to reuse that data elsewhere in the market to create growth. The difficulty here is that we've already got this service, and it would be impossible for a government to say, right, okay, we're just going to cancel out all those services because they don't meet our privacy standards. So what we've got to try and do is unravel it all. It's sort of it's like unraveling a felted jumper in some ways. So I think we're kind of in a place which is, like I say, another fine mess. And I think in unpicking it, what we're seeing is some unintended consequences of that unpicking. So it's like, be careful for what you wish for, because we are seeing those unintended consequences of this pricing of the service when actually we're trying to get to a privacy issue. Yeah. But I think we also should be very aware that what that's doing is offering the likes of Meta and others a route through to pricing and then building more value behind the service. Now, you have to argue whether that's a good or a bad thing. Because actually, if you just take it as a service, it's probably a good thing. Take X, for instance, a service previously known as Twitter. They've recently launched Grok. I don't know whether you've seen that. So Grok is an AI service, supposedly better than ChatGPT, which actually comes within your paid for X service. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we just see Meta putting some sort of price, and they'll be testing it out at the moment. What will people do? What won't people do? Is it really worth it? They've probably priced it more than people would really want to pay for something of that level, and then they'll backfill with services that are valuable enough for people to actually pay for it. So I think in trying to unpick this fine mess, we've given this opportunity to create new value, which actually could be seen as very good, but we still have to unpick this fine mess of privacy behind the scenes.
Okay, and we're going to come back to you later to talk a bit about what that value looks like and make that a bit more tangible. Toby mentioned the price before, and as I said, the part of the judgment was this comment about it would be an appropriate fee could be one way to do this, but and they've set it at like 10 to 13 euros per month. How do we decide what an appropriate amount is for a social media service, which we've all kind of overconsumed for a long time and are used to having for free? Toby, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Also because normally data protection authorities wouldn't necessarily be involved in setting prices in the market. You know, the market will set that for itself. What is a bit interesting in this particular case is that Meta has been offered as free of charge. Not necessarily free, but that's a claim. And what we know from economic theory, you know, normally you would have a service on the market, and then the willingness to pay would kind of dictate how much of that service will people consume. When a service is presumably offered for free, it actually leads to overconsumption, because then people don't see any downside in using the service, and everyone just flock to it essentially. And you know, I'm perhaps exaggerating a bit, but when you don't have a price, then people don't really regulate how much they use of it. And so everyone has been flocking to this service, which heavily relies on network effects. So it really aids the service in kind of gaining this very big portion of the market. And then suddenly, 2 decades down the line, when everyone's heavily invested in it, then suddenly you're faced with a price, or just, you know, give away your data. And our concern right now is that it's a very high price for many people to pay, also looking at the economy and the fact that people are already heavily invested in the service. And so it's more difficult to opt out of a service that you rely on than to decide whether you want to opt into it to begin with. So you're essentially seeing some market failure here, because there wasn't, you know, there's overconsumption, there are network effects, and also I would argue also informational market failures here, because people don't really understand necessarily what's going on. It's very, very complex. But, you know, I think there are some principles that can guide us in assessing this. So, for example, if you set the fee at such a level that people will kind of be nudged towards clicking consent instead, then, you know, and this is being asserted by people lodging complaints, then you do have an issue here. And it's not, you know, some people online are writing, well, this is, you know, comparable to Netflix. I would argue, you know, for many reasons that it isn't. And we also need to be mindful that right now you only need to pay the fee once for all your accounts. It's public knowledge that next year you will have to pay per account. So both your Facebook and Instagram account, you will need to pay for both. And you can't share this with family members. And again, Meta is not offering, you know, videos or television series, etc., etc. So it's not necessarily comparable to, for example, Netflix. So, you know, the case could be made that the fee is actually too high currently, but it's difficult to kind of know where it needs to be.
Yeah. Okay, Natalie, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on this and maybe start from the question as to who should be assessing this, right? And is it the consumer? Is it data protection authorities? Is it the consumer authorities? Or is it the competition authorities? Let's not forget that, you know, Liz, you mentioned that this case started in Germany before the German competition authorities, who actually started by defining what was the relevant market for social media. So really, I think here that we should go back to where the knowledge and the expertise is, and there's some established case law by competition authorities, including at the European level, as to what is an excessive price, right? And I think that there needs to be a close coordination between the authorities involved with the competition authority, so that we get to an answer that is not solely based on data protection. I mentioned earlier, data protection is a fundamental right, but data protection is not an absolute right. And the GDPR says this clearly in recital 4. So here we really need to have a balanced approach, taking into perspective all the different views of the different stakeholders. So that means consumers, advertisers, online services, publishers, and also the need to have access to information in our society.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Augustine, what do you think of that?
The question of pricing is a market issue. No, who am I to say what is a higher or lower pricing? The different situation is when this question of pricing becomes a data protection issue. So one should not be having to pay for privacy in the first place. And the problem that we are facing is that this is presented in that way. So you pay to have a service in which there is no personalized advertising or behavioral advertising. Therefore, your data is better protected, and that is the wrong starting point. And in that regard, we need to keep in mind that this choice has an implication in relation to data protection, in relation to consumer law, because it's a matter of how choices are being presented to consumers. It was made a reference before to consumer law and the use of dark patterns, and could be potentially also a question of competition or contestable markets, which is we are in the field of the Digital Markets Act. And what I agree with something that Liz said before, there are issues around around privacy, and there are issues about data. And what we are facing is also a situation in which a company, in this case, is putting or giving more preeminence to their business model based on the aggregation and collection of data for the purpose of targeted ads, without having sufficient consideration on these privacy implications that we have been discussing earlier. So again, we should keep the conversation alongside that. It's not necessarily about how much are you going to pay, but whether you are paying for more privacy. And just to bring a very graphic example of this, in relation to pay for news, when consumers were presented with the choice between accessing a website, for example, accepting our cookies, rejecting our cookies, most of the consumers reject the cookies. When consumers were presented with a choice between accepting everything or having to pay, the wide majority accepted everything in order to access it without having to pay. So these behavioral aspects needs to be taken into account as well, because if Meta is putting this forward as a cosmetic change in order to continue with their main business model, which is likely to be in breach of the law, then I think the conversation is different about how much is worth the service.
I think what I found interesting is whenever I've mentioned this to like my friends or colleagues who don't think about data and consumer issues all the time like I do, their first reaction is, oh, so we have to pay for privacy. But Natalie, you have a different take, don't you? You don't. I think.
Well, I think it's a bit of a shortcut to say that you have to pay for your fundamental rights, because again, I'm not here to represent Meta, but I just want to stress that GDPR apply in all instances, whether you have to pay or whether you get the service for free. And there are lots of initiatives that are taken from the ecosystem to make this more transparent, more responsible, more accountable, not even mentioning, as a matter of fact, the recent DSA that provides for more transparency, more choice, actually, for consumers, because Article 26 provides for an obligation for the platform to inform consumers who's paying for the ad, what are the main parameters used to target the ad, and then the possibility for the consumer to change those parameters. So there is actually more and more choice. And I could also talk, but I don't want to take too much time, but I could also talk about all the initiatives that are taken in terms of working on privacy enhancing technologies, data clean rooms, and so on and so forth, setting up privacy and ethics committee to really try to get this right to the benefit of consumers. So I think the shortcut that paying for my fundamental rights doesn't take into account what's really happening on the ground.
Okay, thank you. We'll leave the fundamental rights question there. I did want to come back to you quickly, Augustine, on the point that Liz Brand made about these unintended consequences, because we can see that new regulation in Europe, all the digital regulation is pushing business to do things differently. But how would you actually explain to consumers that they cannot now have these services for free, of the things that have become really integral, if that sort of regulation carries on?
Well, the point is that, first of all, I think we need to rephrase it. It's not for free. Nothing is for free.
Yeah.
But the fact is that there should not be a binary choice. Or you pay it, or we need to have this type of advertising business model. The fact that we have been adopting all this legislation in Europe is because the European legislator, representing all of us, have taken the decision that through these laws we should steer markets to develop certain, or to provide for certain positive outcomes for consumer society. This is a democratic decision that was taken, to have the GDPR, to have the DMA, to have consumer law, to have the Charter of Fundamental Rights. The fact that companies resist to those changes is not justification whatsoever, to breach the law in the first place. And then again, it's a question of what is the business models that we want to have in Europe. And I talk about Europe only because of the territorial scope of our rules, but probably this is a debate that we can have somewhere else in the world as well. And for us, there are other alternatives in order to provide these services for consumers against the payment of a monetary sum, a price, which are more in line with other values and our rules. So I think we also need to have a conversation about which are the right business models that we want to see thriving in Europe, and not just simply importing something from outside the EU that is not in line with our rules and values.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting, and it's also helpful because it's bringing us to the last section of this, which is, what do we want? So I'm going to bring Liz Brandt back in here, because what's the value that we're missing for our data with tangibly? What is it that we can get? I mean, because targeted advertising can't be the only idea, can it?
No, I hope not, because I often say, if targeted advertising is the only thing we can do with our data, we obviously don't deserve to inherit the earth, because there are far many things to do with our data than just targeted advertising. And I think actually kind of the pricing of these services gives us an interesting channel, not just for the big tech companies to go and do something new and add new value, but everybody else to add new value. We've got a price now. So we can actually work to some sort of price around what value you can deliver. Now we're in a competitive market. So what price can you deliver? And let's just face it, it's not going to be for advertising. It's not like I'm not going to put my hand up for paying for advertising or not advertising. I'm going to put my hand up for paying for a service that delivers substantial value for me. And I will now start to decide where I'm going to put those pennies, pounds, euros, dollars. And there are many places to do that. So lots of new services coming to the fore as we start to open up how data flows around our markets. And that's being done by this new legislation, as we talked about earlier on, that looks to standardize data, to govern it as it flows around our market. So how does our data flow? Just like in open banking, where my banking data is governed and can be accessible by certified entities to help me manage my money more effectively, manage my budget, savings, soon moving into pensions and insurance. So we can do more with our money, and that's really exciting. But that's just like one sector of data, in fact, subset sector of data. Yeah. What happens when we start to get broader sets of data? What happens when we start to get access to my sleep data, my exercise data, alongside my finance data? What happens when we can actually use that, for instance, to help us understand our mental health and our mental state? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I getting enough exercise? Am I eating the right things? And am I financially burdened, and therefore is my mental health at risk? These are really interesting uses of data beyond just selling more baked beans. Yeah, so we're just advertising is just selling more baked beans. By the way, in a world where consumerism is probably a bad thing for the planet, so there's a new that type of service where I can help myself with my data is really exciting. And then there's other ways of using it. So when I can actually access my data and use my data, for instance, I can find the right insurance, or I can just navigate through a journey in a way that's personalized, which means I don't have to fill out forms or work out whether I'm making a mistake in telling somebody this thing or that thing because actually I bought something. And it's a totally personalized service with my data, my real data, not my guest data. Yeah, the data that's actually the data about me. So that's a simple one for almost every organization to go for. Then you've got, let's say, a decision support tool. Well, what holiday we're going to go on next year? Okay, that's a family. Maybe it's two families going together, trying to plan a holiday. There's some decisioning in there, which is kind of, I mean, it's great fun, but it can be very challenging, and you get all sorts of things. And at the moment, you're just bombarded by adverts. Whereas actually, we can put together a requirement. Okay, we've got 3 kids. We've got a vegetarian. We've got somebody who's disabled, and we want to actually go on a holiday which is adventuring. What are we going to do? And this amount of money. And people can pitch back. That's the intention economy that people talked about. So we've got a new way of using our data. We can combine it together and put it into a requirement set. And then another really interesting one, I think, is in the UK around home buying and how we use that data to help us pull together what is a complex set of decisions all together that create all sorts of problems. And in the home buying market in the UK at the moment, because data arrives at different times and is not coordinated around what the individual is trying to do, so mortgage data, your banking data, the land registry data, the data about whether or not the house is structurally sound, etc. They all arrive at different times, which means that in this country, 1 in 3 transactions fall through. So, which is huge. And it costs, that 1 in 3 transaction failure costs the consumer £270 million a year. It costs estate agents, I know nobody feels sorry for estate agents, but it costs estate agents £1 billion a year. This is this is just a waste of money. And what we need to be able to do is orchestrate all that data across my journey of buying my house, saving me money, me anxiety, and the whole economy. So we're saving money and we're able to build value. So this data and how we can manage that effectively in a safe, governed, standardized way will explode new value opportunities. And that's why when we've got a pricing of €10, 16 years, whatever it is, we've got something we can compete with. How much value can you create?
Yeah, that's a challenge. Well, when we spoke the other day, you had a really good analogy about what we need to do with the data to get it out there. Can you just share that if you remember?
Was it the electricity? Was it the electricity?
Yeah, the grid.
Yeah. So at the moment, I see it that at the moment, data is inside a generator that's inside the likes of the big tech companies, and it's generating electricity and fueling those organizations. And what we're just doing now is creating the grid, the electricity grid for data. We're enabling that data to flow like electricity to multiple places, not just inside one factory. So we're creating the whole of the electricity system, but for data, which basically means all these services I just talked about will be able to be created for individuals, a bit like electricity did with a light bulb, a Hoover, a washing machine, and all the other things that actually are enabled, including what we're doing now, being online by electricity. So I see that flow of data, that grid that we're creating in a safe, secure, standardized way, empowering all of that.
Yeah, and then that involves other things like the Data Governance Act that's going through the EU and various different digital identity things as well.
Exactly.
So we've got some idea of how that might happen, although these things feel almost impossible to imagine because our use of the internet has kind of grown up within a very different framework and culture, really. We're heading nearly towards the end, but I wanted to ask Natalie again. What do you see as the future for the offer that similar to what Meta's made? What do you think more companies will be making this offer, or they'll be watching Meta to see?
I think we could get more of these offers. Again, there are no limits to the creativity of what companies can come up in the interest of consumer choice. One thing maybe that has not been mentioned, and I think it's important to mention here, is we have not really talked about also how targeted advertising is beneficial to consumers. I've just recently bought a house, and targeted advertising has been extremely useful for me to really identify the products I wanted to buy in terms of color, texture, location, and so on and so forth. So let's not forget also that is one of the big advantage of targeted advertising. Liz just mentioned that consumers are being bombarded with ads. Well, I mean, another fact that is important to mention is also that targeted advertising is seen to be as 5 times more efficient than regular advertising, meaning that if you don't have targeted advertising anymore, then you will have 5 times more, most likely more advertising. So I think it's an important thing to mention. And the last thing I want to mention also is the fact that actually the move that is made now is quite interesting, because actually by giving more choice to the consumer, it actually enables consumer to make decisions not only based on price or quality, but also on the basis of privacy that really becomes actually an element of choice for the consumer. So overall, I think it is positive for all stakeholders.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Toby, I just want to come back to you now, and it's around this question of like, what is the alternative then? I mean, how can companies make money if they're cut off from if they're cut off from, say, behavioral advertising, which brings them a lot of profit? What's their alternative?
Well, so interestingly, there's a report which came from the European Commission, I think a couple of years back, kind of looking at, do we really need behavioral, hyper-personalized advertising, or could other forms of advertising be profitable? And the report kind of states that no one is willing to invest in this because behavioral advertising is, again, profit maximizing. So they want that, the players don't necessarily want to move to something that is less profitable. But I think you could still profit on ads, even if you do it in a more data protection friendly way, which is what we're pushing for. So ads will probably always require some form of processing of personal data. That could be okay if you just do it in a way that is proportionate. But I mean, speaking generally, the law sets some boundaries, and then generally you will have innovation within those boundaries. And if we as regulators succeed in being sufficiently clear in terms of what are those boundaries, then I actually think that the market itself is able to identify ways in which you could make money and indeed make a profit. If you look at the companies doing behavioral advertising, they're extremely profitable. I think they could still be very profitable, perhaps not as profitable, if they just respect fundamental rights. And I would also like to say, just for the record, that if something is in the interest of consumers, then allow consumers to make the choice for themselves. Don't hyperimpose your own views as to what is their best interest. Consumers can make informed choices themselves. And the current system whereby your financial situation is kind of used to dictate what choices you will be made, I think that's inherently unfair, because some people don't necessarily have a lot of money. And then suddenly it's not a free choice at all.
Okay, I hear you there. So there are definitely means of monetization, just maybe not such high profit. Augustin, what do you have to say on that?
Yeah.
And I'm interested as well, Augustin, but what, again, in this point of like, what do you want to see instead of this? What does a good future look like? And also, I suppose, how optimistic you are that we'll get there.
I'm an optimistic person by nature, so I think we'll get there. But what we want basically is to see that digital services respect the law And that is the starting point of the conversation. I have no authority to say how a firm should monetize their services, whether they want to develop an advertising-based service or to provide them against a monetary payment. What for me, as a consumer advocate, is important is whatever the choice is done in a manner that complies with the law. Look, we have an unresolved issue in Europe and around the world about behavioral advertising. This has implications not only for consumers in the way their data is being used, but also for the entire digital ecosystem. It is for no reason that there are investigations open against digital platforms in advertising markets. Look, the European Commission in open investigation against Google, where basically they put on the table to break up their advertising business model because of the level of concentration and conflicts of interest that exist in these markets. And when it comes to social media platforms, it's because of this increasing level of personalization and individualized targeting, we're facing what we call the permeability between markets and society, where not only consumers are exposed to personalized commercial advertising, but also to practices that fuel polarization in a world that is deeply divided already. So for me, the discussion that we need to have as well is about how much do we want these companies to continue shaping our public spaces. Europe has made already a choice in its primary and secondary legislation of the values and rights we want to protect. The question that remains for me is what it takes to make them comply with those standards. And the answer will find it in effective enforcement. And through that, we're going to be able to guide the markets to develop and provide the outcomes that we expect as European consumers.
Thanks, Augustin. Yeah, I mean, this is why I really enjoy talking about data, because it's never just about the information. It's about what it does when it's collated, what it does when it's used. And yeah, you quickly get to all these big questions, including, what do we want from our society and our public spaces. Liz, I'm going to give you sort of the final chance to ask how optimistic you are that we'll get to an alternative world where obviously it feels like we're at an inflection point, new legislation coming through, legislation that's already there, being enforced, public and private enforcement, all pushing. So where do you think we're at now, and where do you think we can get to?
Liz, you and I have been at this for a long time. We've had control shift have been in place for 14 years. I thought it was going to be 5 years and then we'd be kind of like done and we'd have all this fantastic value. I kind of wasn't taking into account the fact we had to change the legislation, and also in the fact that we had a small Brexit thing in the middle and we had a small COVID thing in the middle, and so everything's kind of extended. I am now incredibly optimistic about where we are. We did a chunk of work that looked at what the barriers about 4 years ago for the UK government, about what the barriers are, what the enablers are. It was a bit of a dark moment for me because I was like, oh my God, there's an awful lot to be done. And how the hell are we ever going to get there? We are now in a place where I can go through that list of things that need to be done and I can start ticking off an awful lot of things. So tools and capabilities are being designed, at least at a governance level, that enable us to stay safe and easy. And I see businesses coming in and investment coming in to enable that. And that's just incredible. That's just an incredible moment. And once we've got a safe, easy data market, we can create new value, which we've talked about already. And that is going to start to outstrip, I think, what we have ever imagined we could do with data before, what we are seeing at the moment and what we're going to see into the future. We need strong regulation and we need that to be enforced. We need, as individuals, to be able to see, and businesses to be able to see who's doing good things with our data and who's doing bad things with our data. Both good and bad, by the way. I'd like to see both, but if we don't do that, we're not able to see, and also people aren't able to excel as a brand that they are doing the right thing. So we need that to be really, really key. I am now in a place where I think we are absolutely set to create huge value and retain our privacy. It's a very exciting moment.
Thanks, Liz. I think going into this, we were asked the question was about, will pay or okay be the new rule of the consumer data game? I think through these discussions, it's so much wider than that. We're at a transition point where lots of different regulations and behaviours and practices are coming together and really disrupting the status quo that we're used to. Maybe not right now, but maybe in the future. So thanks ever so much, everyone, for joining and bringing all your thoughts and ideas. Thanks to everyone who's been watching, who's watching live or who's watching back. We'll be continuing with Start Talking in 2024. This is the last one for this year. We'll be looking each month at a consumer issue to look at in depth with speakers as illustrious as the ones we have here today. Thanks everybody for watching. Thanks to Liz, Augustine, Natalie and Toby for joining in. You can follow at Euroconsumers on Twitter, X and LinkedIn and keep up with all the latest consumer news. But until then, I'll see you next year. Bye.
Power to the people, someone used to sing. And while singing is not our expertise, empowering people, empowering you is what we do. And in tune. How? We test, analyze and compare products and services to ensure that they meet what you are looking for and comply with the law. We inform, advise, support and represent consumers. And we do this in chorus, which is to say in several countries at the same time. Belgium, Italy, Spain, Portugal and Brazil. Then we dialogue, collaborate and sue companies if needed to make sure people's and your needs are in the best hands. And in the end, we improve the market and we all win. Maybe it does deserve a song. What do you think? Euroconsumers. Empower people, improve the market.